This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Welcome to this week's show with author Alina Sayre about refilling the creative well, which is really about so much more than that. It's about transitioning between major projects, life transitions, recapturing your passion at the end of something like a 4-book series of novels and trying to figure out what you're going to write next. There's so much to get into with this topic, and we do. You may have noticed my voice was a little soft, a little scratchy, not only on this podcast, but some of the other recent ones. I was dealing with an infection for a good, month or two. And so hopefully my voice is back and done with that. Also, we had a little technical issue with one of the mute buttons, so you will hear Arya contributing to this conversation. But it doesn't detract from the conversation at all. And, life happens. So enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Catherine and I are delighted to have Alina Sayre back at the table with us. Alina is the award-winning author of The Voyages of the Legend, a fantasy series for children, as well as several published essays, poems, and a TEDx talk. Her newest book, Fire by Night, is a collection of poems probing the theme of wilderness wandering. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Lingua, Artway, and Ancient Paths. For more of her work, visit alinasayre.com. That's ALINASAYRE. And of course, we'll link to that in the show notes. Alina, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
So today we are going to talk about refilling the creative well, and this is something you have some experience in. Do you want to share your journey? I know you covered this in your TEDx talk, which we will link to. So you finished a 4-book series, and I'm going to let you take it from there. What was that like? What happened?
It has been quite a journey. I published the 4th and final novel of my Voyages of the Legend series in November 2017. And people talk about those mountaintop moments in their lives, and that was definitely one for me. I had set out to start writing this book when I was in college, and one book became 4 books, and standing there as the author of the finished series was just one of the most fulfilling moments I could imagine. What I didn't really anticipate was the what comes next phase. Basically, other than short projects, I'd been working on this series for the better part of a decade.
Right.
And to finish that up was a little bit disorienting, even kind of a letdown to realize, have I completed my peak work? Am I done in my career? I don't even know what comes next. I mean, I'm always incubating ideas and thinking about what else I might write, but I wasn't quite sure what the next thing would be. In fact, I felt tired, and I wasn't so sure ready to take on another big project right away. That last book was a real tough one to write because my writing style is more pantsing than plotting. I figure things out as I go. Unfortunately, wrapping up a series is where the pantsing really causes problems.
Yes.
I painted myself into a few corners and had to paint myself back out again. So I was tired, and I felt drained and disoriented. And just sort of wandered around for a few months after that, trying to figure out, what am I doing next? I don't know. Am I, is this the end of my writing career? I don't know. And I can't say that I set out to do this. It was more something I just did. And that was realize all of the other parts of my life that had sort of been on hold while I was working on the series. As anyone who's written a book knows, it's a lot, and it takes a huge amount of focus and dedication. And I realized I had spent so much time wearing my author hat that I hadn't necessarily worn my human hat as much as I wanted to or should. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious about that place you were in where you were tired and you didn't know what was coming next. I feel like there's more there we could describe or talk about, because it's such an interesting place in the creative person's journey. And I think if we haven't all been there, we're all going to be there at some point. Right. And I think we all experience it to one degree or another at the completion of a big project.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So can we get into that a little bit and then talk more about that realization you had about the human hat?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it occurs for anyone in any position, whether it's, working your job or parenting or just, being. People have this image, I think, of writers and creatives that, we sit in our ivory towers and just come up with great idea after great idea and never get out of it. And while absolutely writing is fun and it's something that I absolutely love, it is also work and it is exhausting, especially when you have high standards for how you want your story to put together. Especially when you're self-publishing, you're doing a lot of your own marketing work. And it's very isolated work, which I like most of the time. Definitely, I'm your textbook introvert here. But even textbook introverts need, outside life. And I just felt like I had kind of overbalanced in favor of the book for such a long time, or the books, because it had been such an ongoing project that I began to realize it was time for me to, that it was okay for me to spend doing other things, even if I wasn't creating anything publishable right now, I was still, I began to see that building my life as a person, taking care of myself, wasn't separate from pursuing my creative career, that the work that I produce comes from who I am as a person. And by neglecting the human side of myself, the human that is all of myself, it was causing me to be tired in the creative process as well.
Right. Would you do anything differently now that you've had that realization, looking back at those, 10 years on the series? You said in your TEDx talk, it was 5 years for the first book and then 5 years for the next 3. So that was really a much quicker process. The investment was really stepped up for those 3 books. So, are you glad that you had that time frame and that intensity and got it done, or do you wish that you had balanced more?
That is a great question. I don't think that I would do it differently. I think, the older I get, the faster life happens. Yeah. And I'm happy to have logged that thing in my life that I'd always wanted to do. This idea that was, burning in my mind. I'm glad that it's down on paper, it's published, and I really hang on to that as something that I'm happy to have done in my 20s. And, people talk about, milestones in life, and there are some traditional milestones I haven't hit at the, prescribed times, but that was a personal milestone that I had really been after. And I think completing that gave me definitely a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. So I don't know that I would change the way I did it, but it was definitely exhausting. Yeah. And I think older, I approach the creative process a little differently, and I think going forward, I may approach it a little bit in a more of a balanced way, or attempt more of a balanced way, as I look towards now longevity in that career. Right. I think when you're 20s, you're just buzzing with energy and have this sense of pending time. And I think now that I'm in my 30s, looking forward, it's a little bit easier to say, okay, like this is the long game. Let's pace ourselves. And, I want to keep creating things. Now I have that sense. How do I pace myself for the long game?
Right. In your TEDx talk, you mentioned a Neil Gaiman quote describing your creative goal as a mountain in the distance. Yes. So when you finished the series, did you feel like you had summited the mountain, or did you feel like the mountain had just moved further off?
That's a great question. In some ways, it was a little of both. Being there at the launch party for my fourth book, I felt like I would love to take a picture and just mail it back in time to my 14-year-old self.
Yeah.
Being a teenager who wanted to write, I always wondered, someday will I be in a bookstore? Will I be a writer? And luckily, having the last name Sayre, I get shelved right in the vicinity of Tolkien and Rowling.
Nice.
It's pretty fun. When I get shelved at all, that is.
Yes.
But so that part was very much like a mountaintop experience. But in that other sense, realizing, okay, what comes next was very much the sense of like, oh, I didn't really think past this part. I think a lot of the narrative structure we see, especially in self-contained things, mini films or TV shows, have to do with, achieving that single goal. That's how the story arc goes. You have the climax and then the resolution, and then you're done.
Yes.
But there's very little discussion of, okay, how do you keep living your life after that climax is hit? Is that the only climax? Are there more climaxes that you didn't know yet? It's kind of like realizing your life is not a single book, but a series, and not being sure what's going to be the rest.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. It doesn't just end with the summit and then happily ever after, right? Right. Was it kind of
life than just writing?
Yes. Was it kind of depressing? I imagine you might feel unmoored having that goal accomplished and then not having the next goal lined up. So, so can you talk about moving through that unmoored space into that where's my human hat realization?
Exactly. I like the word unmoored a lot. Just hearing, sort of spinning in circles. And I think it's a very American conception that we have to be moving forward linearly, and especially in our careers, climb the ladder. And I've never really seen my career path as a ladder. If it is, it's not one that's going straight up and down.
Yes, more of a spiral staircase that might wander.
Exactly. And I think many creatives relate to that. It's not the corporate world, for better or for worse. And sometimes it's hard to figure out if you're going up or down or sideways or getting off entirely.
Right.
So I think it did take me a while to just sort of sit with that space. I allowed myself some time after publishing just to, recover, get some sleep. And that was good. I always need a little bit of time after putting out a book to just put my head back together. But once I was done catching up on sleep, it was sort of like, nothing else is on the docket yet. It's not that I have ideas. It's more, what is my next thing going to be, of the ideas? And do I have the wherewithal to jump into something else large and significant? So yeah, I again don't know that it was a linear path through that. But I guess I began to say yes to things that I had said no to because of the books. Getting out more, trying new things. I was able to do some traveling. I think it was that year, maybe the next. And that I love to travel, and I've gotten a lot of my ideas for my books from different places I've been able to go. So that was really good. And just spending time with the people I love and reconnecting with them. They often get the short end of the stick when I'm deep in.
Definitely. Yes.
And I read a good book. I mentioned it in my TEDx talk by Elizabeth Gilbert called Big Magic. She's better known for Eat, Pray, Love. But Big Magic is about, her creative world. And it's a bit of a meandering book. It's also nonlinear. But she talks about, okay, my first book was Eat, Pray, Love, which is Eat, Love. And then she also faced that space of, okay, have I, reached the peak of my career after my first book? What do I write after this? And she just described her process of like, I'm just going to keep, throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. I love to create. The next thing I write may not be my next Eat, Pray, Love, but if I don't write anything else, it definitely won't be.
Right.
So I began to sort of like play with that idea, figure out what could be next. I definitely didn't feel ready to take on a series. Wasn't so sure I felt ready to take on a novel. And so I began to think about collecting something that I had already written, shorter pieces. And I don't know that I've ever considered myself a professional poet. My focus in college was fiction writing, and it's always been really what I love the most. But I've always kind of written poetry just for fun, as a way to express feelings. I love the sound of words. I love to read poetry. So I began to think, I wonder how many poems I have. I began to collect them. Most of them were in similar spots, but I had them written in journals, and I had them written in, little notebooks and on scraps of paper and in my email. And I was like, why do I have these? But I began to realize I had a pretty large collection. My book Fire by Night has 50 poems, but I'm sure I cut out at least that many again. Oh, wow. Not fit for public consumption.
Right.
And I wasn't so sure at first that it was something I wanted to publish. I began to try to ask myself again, what would I do if it were just me? Like, how do I rediscover that love of just writing for writing?
Yeah.
And after, gathering all those poems and going through them, reading what I had, revising them intensively, I realized, okay, I don't have, a book, but I might have a book. And so I was actually at that point, I was getting ready to put it together at late summer last year, when I sort of unexpectedly got a job offer to teach English for high schoolers. And decided, well, that sounds like a great adventure. So I took the job and quickly realized that I was not going to be able to do anything else while I was teaching.
Yes. Yep.
I did end up writing a few more poems during the year. I met some lovely people who inspired me to take that dream a little bit more seriously. Even watching teens write poems was very inspiring to me. For all of the shenanigans that high schoolers get into. Yep. Some of them were extremely authentic about reaching into those, dark and difficult places inside themselves.
Right. Oh, nice.
And it was for me to be able to coach them through that process of taking themselves seriously and exploring what they had to say inside of themselves. And it kind of made me take an uncomfortable look in the mirror and realize, maybe I need to do this too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's really, I was just going to say that's such an interesting point. We just had Jennifer Bowen Hicks on to talk about the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop and how these students, most of them are untrained writers. So much like the high schoolers, they're coming at it from a very fresh place. And they do go into these very vulnerable, risky spaces inside themselves to pull out their writing, whether it's fiction or CNF or poetry. And maybe what you experienced and what we can learn from the MPWW students as well is that when we hit that place of needing to refresh the well, it's time to go deep and go risky and go vulnerable and see what's inside us.
It's true. And I think especially after writing something established for a length of time, it's very easy to get stuck in a rut where this works. This is my formula. Not that I wrote the books on formula, but I hit kind of a creative rhythm. I knew sort of process I was going to follow and what parameters I was going to stay within, because I'd established them and been working within them for some time. And start deviating from that forced me to really examine, am I going to keep doing what's worked in the past, or am I going to dig deeper to find out what else I have to say? which is terrifying, frankly.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It would be much easier just not to go there. And yet, I think one of the things that inspires me most about art is that it's vulnerable. And goes into the places that only each of us has kind of a unique take on life and on experience. And I think the most powerful art goes the deepest into those places.
Yes, and I love that you were using poetry to explore this, because I think in fiction, our narrative voice, our authorial self can be removed from our true self, but in poetry and in CNF, you're often much more exposed. You're writing from an emotional place instead of from a narrative craft. You know, what is this? What is the story arc? Who are the characters' place?
Exactly. And I think especially as a writer, stepping forward into that narrative is terrifying. It does feel exposed, and I would really rather not do that. I realized that, especially from watching high schoolers write their college application essays, I realized, the most powerful stories come from the greatest vulnerability. I read some really moving essays, even by students who didn't think they liked to write. And the most moving ones were the ones that dug the deepest into sometimes traumatic experiences. Things these teens had experienced at sometimes shockingly young ages that defined them and shaped their view. And I think they brought something beautiful out of their experiences, and the beauty came from the fact that it was raw. And I realized that if an 18-year-old could do it, probably I could too. Right.
And I think this is a nice place to bring up the Ben Franklin quote you mentioned in your TEDx talk, and how life experience informs writing. Do you want to give us the quote and then talk a little bit about that?
He just said, he's attributed as saying, either write something worth reading or do something worth writing.
That's great.
I like that. It's true. And it reminded me that, especially when you're writing in kind of a rhythm, if you're working on a series or a long project and you know how it's going to go, it's easy to feel like you can write something worth reading without digging inside yourself. But when you come to the end of those tracks, I think the two choices are either to keep following the formula because it's safe and comfortable, or feels safe and comfortable, or to jump the tracks and dig deeper and see what else is there, even if it means risking, vulnerability, exposure. I read Brené Brown's book, Daring Greatly, which has to do with vulnerability and the power and the terror of being authentic with other people. And it was inspiring to risk that because it's worth it. She says, I'm still figuring that out.
Right.
I decided to take a risk that it was worth it.
Yeah. Have you started feeling the rewards of this risk taking, or are you still at the early enough stages of that journey that those are yet to come?
I think it's a little of both. I've just come to grips with the fact that I'm always going to be someone who feels the terror of things more sharply than the average person. And so, definitely in the lead up to the publishing of the poetry book, I was a mixture of very excited because I'm excited about these poems. They come from some really vibrant experiences, some of them fantastic and some of them terrible. And I was excited to be writing again and putting something new out, to find out that I could do something different. On the other hand, I kept having this, scream fest in my mind. What are you doing? This is going to be published. And putting out something that is so authentically myself into the world felt like everything in my, what's the part of the brain, the amygdala that triggers fear, is telling me not to. So now that it's out, that is at rest. It's out. nothing that can be done about it now. But it's also something that I feel very, very peaceful about, I guess. Have a fifth book out there, and it's been kind of liberating to reintroduce myself as not just a children's author, but an author.
Right.
I'm now a children's and poetry author, and that reminds me that I can write other things down the road. And it's kind of freed my mind to think, hey, there are many things writing out there. I have many ideas.
Yeah.
Maybe try those, because now I know that I can. So that's been fun to realize, and feels a bit relaxing. Like, oh, I don't have to step into this persona.
Yes.
I'm a fantasy author. Listen to me because I'm excited.
Right. Right. It's like you got to peel off one label and open up space for new labels, new personas, new endeavors.
Exactly. And I guess that's kind of the reward of taking that risk, to realize I can be both. And that's a relief to be able to be more authentic. So awesome. Even as it's terrifying at the same time.
Right. Well, would you like to read one of your poems?
I would love to.
Excellent. I would love to hear one.
Haven't read publicly from the book yet, so you guys get to be my first audience.
Yay, that's exciting.
So I'm actually reading from my proof copy here. My actual copies are still in the mail because it's brand new.
Nice. That's right. It just came out November 2nd, so just this month. And while we're mentioning that, where can people find it?
Oh, well, currently it's on Amazon. It's in paperback and ebook. I will say the paperback, I did something a little differently this time. The Kindle version is bare bones. I wanted to keep it as simple and affordable as possible, so it's just the poems.
Okay.
Paperback, I had a little more fun, and I'm also an amateur photographer in my spare time, and so I included some photographs.
Oh, nice.
To kind of, it's divided into 7 stages. That kind of group the poems by different segments of a journey that roughly mirrors my own. So I found a photo for each of the segments that sort of encapsulates where that was going. So I thought that would be a nice addition to the paperback edition. And also I just like to hold it in my hands.
Yeah, me too. And it's a nice incentive to buy the paperback.
I feel like poetry isn't something I would have liked to read in an ebook, because I do like poetry a lot. I'll often read a few poems before bed at night, or, pack them along if I'm going somewhere. So I wanted to give people the opportunity to read in that way too. But some people love to read everything on Kindle, so I didn't want to shut that out either. Definitely.
Excellent. Well, the stage is yours.
Fabulous. So I'm going to read the last poem in the book. It's called Spelunking, which is a term for going down into caves. And this poem was actually previously published in Ancient Paths Literary Magazine. And it sort of came to me more fully formed than poems sometimes come. And it describes kind of the journey in one capsule. So it's the last poem in the book. The way is dark. You can avoid it and remain in the sunlight. You can step nearer and admire the doorway. But the way to the sanctuary of God is a mine shaft. If you enter, you must go spelunking down into the dark. You will face the fear of getting lost, of being trapped, of not being able to return the way you came. There are lonely, silent lakes underground, and cracks so narrow your shoulders will stick. But when your pulse calms, you will go forward, downward, inward, to catch torchlight glimpses of towering stalagmite forests and glittering walls veined with quartz and sediments of unnameable colors that were ancient before your ancestors breathed. All this and a chuckle of not aloneness in the deeps are the prize of the one who climbs into the dark. But if you turn to the sunlit lands, you will be unable to speak of the things you have seen to the dwellers there. You will have no tongue, and they will have no ears. You will be silent, except to God and to those who have their own glimpses beneath the earth by torchlight. So that is the final poem of the book.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you for reading that.
I always feel like I'm back in high school reciting.
Oh. or like you're living the author's dream of reading publicly, right?
Kind of crazy. It's both. It's another thing that is both delightful and terrifying in life.
It is, but it's such a good thing to become comfortable with. Come back next week when we continue our conversation with author Alina Sayre.
Hey, we'd love to have a rating or review on your podcast distributor of choice, whether that's iTunes, Stitcher, or some other. If you'd like to head over there and just leave whatever rating and review you'd like to, it would really help us keep the podcast going. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.